With me today, I have a special guest, Taylor Wencel. Taylor Wencel is the intelligence specialist for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office for the state of Minnesota. She brings extensive experience supporting survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking through trauma-informed, victim-centered approaches, while also assisting law enforcement with investigations through multidisciplinary collaboration, technical assistance, and data analysis. What is the biggest measure you could tell to give some parents some confidence into what they should be looking in? Because I know this is one of those things that is really scary that's out there, and I'm sure they're worried about their, teenage daughters or, those kinds of things, and they're thinking, what could I do to help prevent my child from becoming a victim of this? And what would you say to that?
Being aware of what apps your kids are using. If you're allowing your kids to be on social media, you also need to be educated on what that app or gaming platform is. A lot of people think that like Roblox or Minecraft is just or Discord is just so innocent. Well, what do they all have in common? They have a chat feature, and a chat feature allows you to talk to anybody. And one thing I also talk about comes from the FBI stats on, I think in 2021, that an average of 500,000 perpetrators, so 500,000, are online every single day. Just because you turn the magic age of 18 doesn't mean exploitation stops. It continues on. The laws are just different around it. And one thing, in my line of work is we've realized that the combination, that trafficking isn't just always on the boulevard of a street, right? Like Pretty Woman. Yes, it's still like that, but it's all online. The recruitment's happening on Snapchat, on Instagram, on TikTok, and gaming platforms, and we're seeing that the exploitation is the start of it, and then it leads into that trafficking component, and now we're a third party is benefiting.
Welcome to Iron and Empathy, the podcast where we explore what it truly takes to build strong, resilient teams in high-stakes environments. I'm your host, Drew Moldenhauer. Iron and Empathy is proudly sponsored by Blue Ethos Specialized Training, a national leader in workplace violence prevention, active threat preparedness, and de-escalation training. At Blue Ethos, we don't just focus on safety. We help organizations improve workplace culture by strengthening communication, increasing situational awareness, and creating environments where people feel supported, empowered, and prepared to intervene early before problems escalate. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's conversation. With me today, I have a special guest, Taylor Wencel. Taylor Wencel is the intelligence specialist for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office for the state of Minnesota. She brings extensive experience supporting survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking through trauma-informed, victim-centered approaches, while also assisting law enforcement with investigations through multidisciplinary collaboration, technical assistance, and data analysis. Taylor provides training to law enforcement, social workers, mental health professionals, school administrators, educators, students, and parents across Minnesota, throughout the United States and into Canada. Her training topics include crime prevention, victim support, human trafficking, internet crimes against children, sextortion, online safety, and missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, with a focus on the risk factors of exploitation, disappearance, and homicide. Taylor previously served with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension as a victim specialist for Human Trafficking State Task Force and as an education coordinator for the Predatory Crime Section, where she designed and delivered statewide and national training initiatives. She continues to support complex cases, strengthen investigative responses, and build cross-system capacity through education and collaboration. Really happy to have Taylor with us today. Taylor, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this work with the MMIR office, and just let's get into it. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's really not something I saw myself in. I get asked that a lot of how I got into this work, and what I start off by saying is jobs are always coming up left and right, things that you never thought you were going to be in, right? We were kind of put into these boxes like doctors, lawyers, teachers, and cops. So I guess long story short, I was going to be in law enforcement. That's what I was going to do forever. I was on my way to skills and I said, I don't know, I need to switch it up. Left, did social work, said that's not for me. Took some time off school, came back, was going to be a cop again. Then I said, no, I'm just not going to do it. So I ended up doing criminal justice sociology, double majoring. And while I was double majoring in sociology that I said I never would do, I got to learn about human trafficking. My now best friend since that time, she was the first regional navigator in the eastern side of the state of North Dakota. I met with her. I learned about human trafficking. Everyone, I think, was under the understanding that it was a white van that pulls up, grabs you, or it's happening in other countries. And that's not the case. That's not in the 10 years that I've been doing this, almost 10 years. I've never seen it like that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I was hired from a nonprofit called the Rape and Abuse Crisis Center, and they worked with domestic violence and sexual assault victims. And I ended up specializing, working with the adult victims on the eastern side of the state for human trafficking. So my youngest was 18 all the way up to like 72. And I worked with law enforcement, service providers, mental health, medical staff, just to kind of do those wraparound services and crisis work, shelters, things that you see every single day, jails. And then I ended up working with a youth agency for human trafficking, and I was the human trafficking specialist there. So my youngest was like 10 all the way up to the age of 24 due to the safe harbor law. And then I went on a girls trip, met my now husband, said I would never move to Minnesota. I loved my North Dakota home, and I was the first BCA, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's first victim specialist for the Human Trafficking Task Force. And what's really unique there is it's not a specific jurisdiction. They cover the entire state. Being in that line of work, once you're in that, you can never really leave. And so my husband's in law enforcement. Some things ended up crossing over. So I just never felt like I had a break, if that makes sense. So I wanted to do more macro level and not frontline work and still remain within my passion. I left. I worked with domestic violence offenders on their psychoeducation after they were charged. So that actually helped me put a different perspective in. And while I was working with them on the curriculum, I noticed that there was some trafficking happening and drug use in the backgrounds. And then I got a call from my prior boss who said, we would like you to come back to the BCA and be the education coordinator. And I said, what the hell is that? And so basically for the predatory crimes section, I combined internet crimes against children with human trafficking, put curriculums together and help train all facets. So law enforcement, mental health staff, schools, parents, students, you name it, we trained across the state. And I really wanted to combine where the online exploitation was meeting human trafficking or the potential for that, because it all coexists. And then I met my now coworker who said there was a spot open in their agency because we did human trafficking trainings together. And I've been in this office now for 2 years. It's not something that I'm familiar with or my background. Missing and murdered, my office has been in existence. We call it a toddler years. It's only been in existence for 3 years, but we are the first in the nation, and we are under the Department of Public Safety for the state, which is really unique. So we're not a nonprofit. We have state agency rights and things like that. But then that also caveats with restrictions. And a little bit how we're unique is the fact that we have our whole population is under 2% for Indigenous across all of Minnesota, and missing women and girls make up 10% of that. So they saw that there was an epidemic. We are written into statute and into law. And so we are the office, and there's a mighty team of 5 of us, and I'm the intelligence specialist, so it covers the entire state. And so a little bit about me is I work with law enforcement in assisting in their investigations. We're not an investigation agency, but we assist. I call it the tool within the toolbox. We hold multidisciplinary team responses for anyone that's gone missing, has a suspicious death, or has been murdered. Also, I worked for the medical examiner's office, which I never thought I'd work with my career. It's been very interesting. And I also do trainings across the state and into Canada, which has been really unique, also nationwide. So I got to really build my role, and I get to collect data that's non-existent within the whole state. And if it is, it's very limited across the nation even. And one of our mandates out of the 20 really tells us that we have to work with other states and also into Canada. So we have been learning a lot from them. They've been learning a lot from us on what works and what doesn't, and getting the awareness out.
Fantastic. And that's quite the background that you have with this. And so I just want to back up a little bit here just for our listeners that are listening to this for the first time, and maybe they don't know a whole lot about human trafficking, or like you were talking about, online exploitation. So if we could bring this up into layman terms, I guess my question to you is, what exactly is human trafficking? What is online exploitation? And then where is it in Minnesota that you're seeing maybe an increase of this, or certain areas and pockets of it really that are taking off that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah. Well, let me start off by saying human trafficking is really the umbrella word, right? So think of an umbrella and it breaks down into different sectors. So there's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking, and human trafficking is just that overarching term. One thing that's really unique about Minnesota when it comes to human or sex trafficking or human trafficking is our statute is very progressive and not like most states. So federally, there's two different definitions for trafficking versus our state and the federal definition. And so for federally, anyone above the age of 18, investigators and prosecutors have to prove force, fraud, and coercion. And one of the hard things with that, right, is it's very dynamic. It's really a lot of hurdles to jump over. It's lengthy. It's not a cut and dry investigation. And you're working with victims who have been in a lot of crisis, also been psychologically, sexually, physically, and mentally abused and emotionally abused. And then you have to have them through the duration of that prosecution if it goes there. And so that's a federally. And also federally, if it's under the age of 18, those three components do not need to be proved. We just need to prove that there was commercial sexual exploitation happening. It's very confusing. Usually trafficking as well. Think of like a triangle and the basics of economics, right? You have a demand, which is the buyer, and then you have the supplier, which is the supplying of sex or labor, and that is supplied. And then there's a third party benefiting it that's manufacturing it, right? So that's the trafficker. So if you break it down really into simplistic, think of a triangle and the basics of economics. Why Minnesota is unique is because in our law, in our statute, it's broken down that we only have to prove force and fraud, not coercion. And in our statute, it's labeled as anything of value. So when you think about sex trafficking or selling of sex, most people think of it in monetary terms, that the money is being exchanged. So why that gives us a benefit is we can prove, if someone paid for your hair to get done, your nails, jewelry, a purse, transportation, Uber Eats. We had in one of my sectings or the demand operations that I was part of, we would do one for demand to see how many buyers we could arrest. And then also recovery operations, we would never arrest the victims or the survivors, but we would offer recovery services. And during one of the stings, we realized that a guy didn't have money, but he said, I will pay with rotisserie chicken. So we could charge that. And yes, it's funny, but think of that. Someone's offering for somebody's body for a rotisserie chicken. And so we were able to charge that. So drugs, also shelter, like if you have to couch hop. So really we can prove anything of value to that person. So it's really unique that way. As far as online enticement and grooming goes, grooming is a really hot term. That is just every aspect of social media that you're on, gaming platforms that have a chat feature. Really, if you break it down simplistically, it's really a relationship, whether that's like an intimate, an acquaintance, a friendship, and whatever that looks like. There's an exchange that's happening. There's a process of grooming that goes on, and it's very much in a spectrum. There's a trust that's developed, right? And so there's something that's happening. And online enticement, it's at your fingertips. I don't leave my house without my phone. I feel naked without it. I'm going to turn around and go get it, right? And same thing with like youth and adults. And just because you turn the magic age of 18 doesn't mean exploitation stops. It continues on. The laws are just different around it. And one thing, in my line of work is we've realized that the combination, that trafficking isn't just always on the boulevard of a street, right? Like Pretty Woman. Yes, it's still like that, but it's all online. The recruitment's happening on Snapchat, on Instagram, on TikTok, and gaming platforms. And we're seeing that the exploitation's the start of it. And then it leads into that trafficking component. Now where a third party is benefiting. OnlyFans, the entrepreneur sites that seem so innocent, but really have a lot of risks to it. So, and then to your third question, asking kind of where is it happening the most? Everywhere. I think people are going to think that it's only in the city and the big cities. Yes, absolutely, it's happening, but you will be surprised to know that rural communities are very much that's happening, and it's happening at higher rates. And there's youth and adults selling themselves for a survival need. And if that's, drugs, drugs, a place to sleep, transportation, food, anything for a survival need. And then, that exploitation, that vulnerability is there, so it gets exploited upon. So anything that has a potential benefit or a gain can be exploitable.
Okay. And, this is a very fascinating topic to me because as a police officer, 18 years, I know we had a little bit of training on this as patrol officers, but I think this is something for, community members, for dispatchers, police officers, everyone that they can learn more about because of this. And I'm just curious with you, with this kind of stuff, how does this cycle happen? So when you were talking about this, and you explained it very well about this triangle, and you have the person that is out there recruiting these individuals to do that. How does this happen? What are they looking for? How does this whole thing, they're not just going, like you said, white van on the street, going and grab people. It might happen, but it's very rare. But what are they doing? What are they looking for? How does people get trapped up into this cycle?
I wish it was cut and dry and black and white and I could just serve you an easy answer. It's not like that, unfortunately. When I train on this, I really try to break it down in different categories. So I break down the different types of traffickers, if you will. And then I also break down where recruitment happens, and where it predominantly happens. And people I think are always suspecting that or assuming even that it's going to be in these really bad areas, and it's going to be in maybe a strip club or a bar, or you're walking the night, whatever. Yeah, that is definitely possible. But it's also literally in a school from peer to peer. Friends can recruit. I've seen kids recruit other kids. One of the major cases that was here in Minnesota, it went federal. Anton Lazaro's case, it was a federal case. We were part of that at the BCA. That was one of my first cases I worked. And he had a 19-year-old recruiting for his fetish of younger girls, quote unquote. And so she would meet them at school, college, high school, go to a treatment center and bring them back in, which I can touch on. But a lot of the times it's going to be a peer-to-peer. It can also be a lot of the intimate partner. We see that boyfriend, or I would say girlfriend, and I'm going to use the words, know that boys do get trafficked, but girls are predominantly higher. So that's what we see. And I don't try to disregard that. I'm also just trying to say what we predominantly see. LGBTQIA plus individuals, they're easily exploitable, unfortunately. But we see the intimate partner, unfortunately, family members. We call it familial trafficking. And that will be like a mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, sibling, cousin that is trafficking out their family member. We do see that, unfortunately. We also see that there's, where it seems like, hey, I'm going to approach you and I have a job to offer you. You're going to make a lot of money. You don't have to do much, yada, yada, yada. Or maybe it's like, hey, you're really pretty and this is a modeling gig and or you could be an influencer. Well, again, what in life is free? Really nothing. And there's always exploitable opportunities. So we call that a CEO trafficker. Usually that's how that one works, where it's like, oh, we could both benefit off this. I'll take a small cut. You take the rest. This will be your business and you're an entrepreneur. Well, that doesn't pan out that way. A lot of people are going to think traffickers too are we call it the guerrilla trafficker, the guerrilla pimp. And yes, the trafficker can kind of jump in between all of these scenarios, but unfortunately, they don't just stay there, right? And so that's where they're really aggressive. They really are threatening your life or your family's, really isolating you. And then there's also the rescuer who comes in and is like, hey, I heard you were kicked out or you don't have a place to stay. Come stay on my couch. Well, now you've been there for 2 weeks. Now you've eaten my food. Now you've used my drugs. I've given you transportation and rides. And now you have to owe me. Well, you don't have anything. Okay, well, then you have to sleep with my friend. And then he pays and I get the money back. Or you have to sleep with me, right? So there's just a lot of dynamics. We see a lot of traffickers hang out at or send in their recruiters or their bottoms, which is the girl that's been there the longest. And so think of a totem pole, right? Where do you need to have the most strength? You need to have it at the bottom so you can keep building. And so that is the bottom. And she's been there the longest, knows the game, knows the quotes, how much money needs to be made, what it looks like, how many people that you sleep with in a day. And so that person also goes in and recruits and goes into maybe jails, right? And what do you do in jails? You assimilate to a general population. It's maybe at a treatment center. What do we all do? We sit down and we have an AA and we sit down and say, my name's Taylor. I'm an addict and we have to get to the root of the problem. And now they say, oh, you don't have a ride back to your apartment? Well, my boyfriend can give you a ride. And they become friends, right? So it's really anything and everything. And then, shelters where on Mondays and Fridays at 5 p.m., we would always see big crises happen. And we would say, oh my gosh, we got them into a shelter. Heck yeah. And then come to realize there's easily exploitable things that are happening even with women only shelters, right? So, I mean, everywhere, social media, I'm hitting you up for job opportunities, modeling gigs, OnlyFans. I mean, everywhere. So that's the thing that kind of sucks. It's never just this nice little box where you can protect yourself. It's really everywhere that we all are. Lastly, I'll say I will go into a grocery store. My husband will be like, what are you looking at? Because I have people watch. Or we're at a basketball game or a softball game, right? And he's like, well, what are you looking at? And I'm like, I'm just thinking of how many people here are either going to be trafficked or are trafficked that we don't know. They're walking among us. They're not tied to a basement chains, and they're going to school with your kids, and you know, they're in your grocery stores. They're with you every single day, and you don't even know that they're being trafficked.
Interesting. And I love the way that you described that this is happening, you know, right underneath our noses, and a lot of people don't understand it about what's going on. And I'm one of those too that, you know, through my training as a police officer, they gave us little indicators to look for. But I kind of want to just, since we're on this topic right now, what are some little things that, you know, the last time I was at the airport, I looked up and I was on the tram and I saw something that said, hey, be alert for people maybe that are here, you know, against their will, those kinds of things. Are there signs that people can do? And we'll get into this a little bit later as well, but just off the top of your head, little signs that, you know, maybe people are going to the grocery store, maybe they are in the airport. What are some signs that maybe the things that you're looking for that people can look for that, hey, maybe this person is being held against their will or being trafficked?
Great question. Another one that doesn't have a cut and dry answer for you. The reason why is because all the lists that I could list out that are signs, you might see one, you might see two. And one of them, when I do my presentations, I always say no one can look at this slide yet, because the first one will state withdrawn, afraid to talk, communication censored, right? And that's not always the case. And also inconsistent stories. Well, what do we know about trauma or drug use or being homeless? If you haven't eaten, are you really going to have your stuff in a chronological order? No. The other thing is truancy. Well, kids, yeah, they could be truant or they don't show up or whatever it looks like. It could be a spectrum of things, right? And so the other thing I will say, a couple things that you could look for is, you know, multiple phones, them not holding their own personal items. Also, no eye contact. That can also be cultural. So do you see where I'm going with this? It's like all these things. And the other point is, so what I train law enforcement on all the time is what goes together, drugs and sex. And then the other thing that goes really hand in hand, and I try to, that's another curriculum I'm really trying to put into too, is post-credit certified, hopefully, is domestic violence. You're never going to, I shouldn't say never, most likely you're not going to ever get a call for, this is the trafficking situation. If you are, it's more grandiose than what it's described as, more grandiose, right? And so I always say you're going to get a call for domestics. And that's identical. Trafficking looks identical to domestic violence. The isolation, the control aspect, the power and control dynamics, how many times it takes to leave for that individual to leave. On average, it's around 7 to 15 times. Same with trafficking, right? And traffickers have children with their victims or survivors, or they're in a relationship. A lot of the time also, victim survivors are don't know that they are a victim. They might have been sexually assaulted their whole life, right? And so they don't know that this is any different, or it's normalized behavior, or this is what they are just doing to have to survive or to get by. I always say, who woke up one day and said, I want to be a drug addict, homeless, or a sex worker? No one, right? Right. So a lot of the time too, it may look like, I hate the word prostitution, but that's in the statute. I call it sex work. So there's a lot. That's the other thing is I try to break down the different categories. But you're going to see, you know, substance use. I probably wouldn't want to have sex with random men and be sober while doing it and being forced to do it, right? Okay. So also, if I was homeless in Minnesota when it's cold, I'm not doing that sober. And so that's also a coping mechanism. And a lot of the time, if they're not addicted to drugs, their trafficker is going to make them addicted to drugs to make it a compliance tool. So some things to see, like I said, is really looking at kind of a lot and putting it into a small box, watching how, somebody's treated in public. Also, they could be treated really well. But another thing is, like, if they don't have a ride of their own, if, it looks like a domestic, kind of watch a little bit more. They're not always going to be dressed in sexy lingerie. They're probably going to have their hair up in a pony and sweats on. So they're just kind of dispelling some of those myths of like what we've always been told. To your point about the airport, that's another thing us at the BCA we did. We trained the airport security and police to watch for things. The other thing that we ended up doing is a lot of like youth would hang out at like transient areas and bus stops and the airport. And we have helped them intercept a lot of those things. And same with like Target. Like if you think about like when you're out and about, I love Target. I don't know what girl doesn't. I trained Target in Florida, Arizona, and Minnesota because they cover those jurisdictions. And, a girl was working at Target so that she didn't have to have sex on her time of the month. And her boyfriend said, okay, well now steal stuff there and then go sell it because I need to make money. So these are things that they're doing that isn't always just put into, like I said, that box. You're going to see a lot of different things. And lastly, the commander at the Human Trafficking Task Force here in Minnesota is Rachel Fensky. And she would always say to law enforcement agencies, they would say, we don't have trafficking here. And she would say, do you have guns? Do you have drugs? Do you have hotels? Do you have domestics? And do you have sexual assault? And when the answer is yes to all of those, you do have trafficking. So, and trafficking can come in through like a CPS case, a child protection case, a missing persons case, a fraudulent case, a theft case, an assault case. So we always talk about our presentation or our curriculum is always looking beyond that initial call and really kind of hindsight's 2020, obviously, but really kind of focusing on the smallest details that can maybe like, that didn't sit right or the things didn't add up. So if you have all of those things, you have trafficking because trafficking fits in all those components of those crimes.
It's interesting you say that. And I just want to say kind of from the aspect of being a police officer, two things you just talked about there. It's kind of like when you're going up and you're making that traffic stop as a police officer, I'm going there and I'm starting to see little indicators that maybe there's drugs in the car. For example, there's two people in the car. There are two stories of where they're coming from and where they're going to are a little bit different. They light up a cigarette right away. I'm starting to see some paraphernalia. When you start going beyond that scope of the reason of the stop and you're starting to see those factors like you're talking about, it's interesting how it all intertwines to each other and you can start to find out more information before you know it. You're finding more drugs in the car. So, and one of the other things you talked about was that power and control wheel with domestic assaults. And I remember teaching on this, especially when I was in my high school classes and intro to criminal justice about, if I want to influence someone, one of the best ways that I can do that is isolate them. Because if I isolate you away from all of your friends, and all of a sudden, maybe you have this group of friends and this one friend's gone and now they're hanging out with just this one person. Well, if you isolate, you can influence so much easier. So I love that you're hitting on a couple of those tactics because when people start to say, I was really good friends with this one person, whatever, but all of a sudden they are just isolated. They move this person out there and the way that they're doing things, those are big indicators. And I like how you talked about that. Now, earlier you had talked about this, about how the numbers, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but you said with Indigenous women, the numbers were higher than, the other categories that you were looking at. Could you explain a little bit more into that and why that is based on your findings?
Yeah. And before I answer that, that's one thing that we also train on is it's called patrol on a traffic stop is indicators of trafficking. And it's very interesting because you're going to find most of your things on a traffic stop. But also a lot of things you're going to miss on a traffic stop, right? There's a lot of things happening. And so there's definitely indicators to be looking for within a small car or a vehicle in just general. So yeah, that's very interesting that you say that. With the Indigenous population, again, the whole population of the whole state is just under 2% that identify as Indigenous. And women and girls only, that doesn't include men and boys, this is just women and girls, go missing. And it was when I started the office, it was at 8% and has now gone up 10%. Wow. Nationally, if I can always send this to, and I put on, I will always forever, I don't care how old this study is. It's a national study from the National Criminal Justice Training Center in Fox Valley. And they interviewed women specifically that were Indigenous, and 84.4% of them have said that they've experienced some sort of violence in their life. half of them, 55.5% of them, have experienced sexual assault, have also experienced at a half rate domestic violence by a partner, which is when you're supposed to always trust and live your life with. The other point was like 48% have experienced stalking, which is terrifying. If you know anyone who's ever been stalked, you don't know what's happening, where you are, where you're going, if that's going to, be the next thing that happens. And then Native women and girls are 10 times higher to go missing or murdered than any other ethnicity in the whole population.
Wow. And could you expand on why, maybe you have these facts, statistics, or what is it that is causing for that population to have these numbers so high?
So one thing that our office had to do before it came really into existence, it was a task force prior to it being embedded into the legislature. It was the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, and they did a study. It's 169 pages, and it's really well worth it. And basically, it walks through why these risk factors are there, why this happens. It really is interesting. There's 5 root causes, and some of these root causes are like obviously colonization, and people don't realize how that still impacts to this day, or they'll say, just get over it. Well, if it's still impacting you today because of your daily life, you can't get over it. The system is also not set up for that. It's a setup for failure. And if you really go back into like 1400s when Columbus discovered, which I hate that because he didn't discover the land, he stumbled upon it, and there was indigenous people that were here 8,000 years prior. He wrote in his journals about selling how European men specifically liked the indigenous little girls that were 10 to 14 years old, and he was selling them. Trafficking started then. And traditionally, indigenous people aren't homeless, right? That's been where there's been boarding schools. And if you don't know about those things, that's a very whole other conversation. There's also, if my grandma was in a boarding school, my daughters would have a high probability of being trafficked. So it's very interesting, the lineage that happens with that. Also, there's such a sexual objectification of indigenous women. So one thing that we're seeing for years is in sex buyers find indigenous women to be sexual, unworthy of respect. They're kind of just disposable and objectified. And that's kind of been a theme through the decades, really. And history has proven that. And so indigenous women can also be very ambiguous. I get told all the time, like, what are you? Like, what's your ethnicity? You could fit this, you could fit that. And that's exactly indigenous women. They can fit depending on the color of their skin and what they look like. They could be labeled as Black, Hispanic, Latino, white, indigenous, Spanish, whatever it looks like, right? Asian. And so instead of a trafficker having to find all these different girls to fit the dynamic or the wants of the buyer, they can just sell one girl and relabel her. With drugs, right? You run out of that supply. With a human being, you can sell them over and over and over and over and over again. And so that's also been a point that has been played into the exploitation. Also, if you think about it, like, people think that indigenous people are on their reservation. If they're not enrolled, they're probably not living there. Or even if they are enrolled, they're not living there, right? And in rural communities, you don't have resources. Or maybe if I report something, my brother-in-law or my sister-in-law is the cop that shows up, and now there's a conflict of interest. I'm not going to say anything, right?
Sure.
Or I have to go to court and the judge knows the family that just abused me, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics here. Again, it's a lot of crossover to domestic violence or conflict of interest, or people not really knowing what it looks like. And also, when somebody goes missing or murdered, a lot of the time they're mislabeled in their ethnicity. So the data is not even accurate. So that's a whole other beast. And sometimes, people don't identify as indigenous, but they are. So like, again, that's another thing that kind of, or if they're missing and the identity of their ethnicity isn't really labeled accurately on the missing, you don't know what you're looking for. And so there's a lot of components, but yeah, it's really interesting. There's 5 root causes to what makes a person go missing or murdered on top of the systemic factors or even trafficked. And
interesting.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say too is really interesting is, up in Canada, we've gone up now 2 years in a row, and there's a whole other success story with that. But as we were up there, we got to know people really well. And I was sent a study right before I went to Florida to do a national training. And it's basically from Thompson and Reuters and TRSS here in the States. And they did a study and it was talking mostly about Indigenous women and how sex ads that sell sex can link to missing persons. And so that's something that we're working on actively in our office. And I was actually on Spotlight today. They got me access. And I actually was trying to find one of the missing girls here in Minnesota. And we don't know for sure, but I can do facial recognition. And then she's maybe popped up on a couple sex ads. And so it's very interesting how we're tying everything together.
Wow. Could you expand a little bit more on that? Because I find that really interesting. So what you're saying is with these ads and with the missing people, that sometimes now with your investigation, you're able to see if you can correlate the two to find these missing people?
Yeah. So again, we're not an investigative agency, but like I assist with it. Right. And so it's hard to describe, but basically, long story short, in the ads, in the study, it talks about how the ads of sex ads can link to missing persons, and how that really defines it is through contextual evidence, geolocation. So once that somebody was posted, we can look at the date it was posted, the time, the location, and then we can look at the small details of like if it's in a hotel or a house or the backgrounds, the comforter on the bed, the photos on the hotel wall. We can start comparing some of those things, and then we can watch that and track that sex ad, and a phone number is usually linked to it. Whether that's a text now number or whatever it is, we have something that can link that to prove that this person is alive and they're being moved, or they're there, but they're being sold. And so that is also something that I can then take, kind of put it into an analytical tool for law enforcement, say, here's your missing persons case, but also look at they're being sold for sex. We don't know if that's them doing it themselves or that they don't want that being forced to do it. Maybe they don't even know that they are being forced to do it. And so there's a lot of things that sex ads really could tell you and paint the picture of a more full story for you. Yeah, it's wild. Never thought about that. And I never thought my trafficking world and missing persons would kind of interrelate, and they do.
Interesting.
The longer you wait for somebody when they're missing, obviously the countdown's on until possibly they're not coming home or they're murdered, right? And so there's a lot of links to all these components, and it's kind of wild.
Okay. So with that, a couple of things you mentioned, and this is just from me being out and, hearing stuff in the public where people have mentioned some things. And I just want to see if maybe you can dispel some of these as maybe rumor or fact. But with the fact of these numbers being so much higher for Indigenous women, are you seeing more of those numbers almost as hotspots, if you will, around reservations? And if so, I know I've heard some that people have said, on Mille Lacs Lake, this happens quite a bit with ice fishermen and, this kind of stuff. Is any of that true, or is this just, bar talk, or is that real that you are seeing from your side of things?
Yeah. Funny that you bring that up, because the Thompson and Rudder study, I'm working with a senior analyst, and he lives in Virginia, and they're actually coming here because of our connection. They're going to do another study up into Canada and bring it down into Minnesota. So to answer the ice fishing theory, it's true. But also I think people think because, the Super Bowl was here a couple years ago, or the Final Four, that's when trafficking happens. No, it's always happening, and it's happening in your backyard. However, is there a spike of like more sex ads being posted or people coming here, and now you have a bigger population in one area? Yes. Does that amplify things? Totally. But it's interesting you say that, because one thing I was always like, we should get on the ice and do like an operation when I was at the BCA or even in North Dakota. So that's something that's always been talked about. But one thing I'm working with the senior analyst, Andrew Workman, on is his brain is just fascinating. And he said, can I show you something? And I said, yeah, sure. He's not from North Dakota, like the Midwest by any means. And he took sections of North Dakota, sections of Minnesota, and sections of Canada, and then jurisdictioned out like hunting times and what you would hunt for and when sex ads would peak. Wild. And now talking about it, you're like, well, yeah, duh, right? But you don't think about those things. You're always like, oh, hunters are up here and everything's good and glory. Well, that's not always the case. And I think people thought too, like when the oil boom hit, right, in North Dakota, that's when trafficking occurred. No, it's always been there. Again, was there a spike? Was there people coming up there for more money? Totally. Was there man camps? Yes. Is that something that our office actually is mandate? One of the mandates kind of doesn't specifically say that, but we're supposed to be working with extraction and agencies and industry on man camps. Yes, because it is a thing. However, the trafficking's always happening, and it's happening in your backyard. And it's not just happening to individuals that are, rough around the edges or had a lot of trauma. It's happening to kids, adults that come from really great backgrounds, parents very involved, wealthy homes and neighborhoods, nice hotels. It's not like the Motel 6 down the way. It's in nice hotels too. So it's happening everywhere.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, it's, this stuff is happening everywhere. You're just seeing spikes with it during certain times. And some of the data is showing that, right? When you get this large group of men, maybe in this area during this time, some of those ads spike, some of that activity does spike, but it's always been there. It's just certain times that data is spiking.
Yes. And I will say, to answer your hot spots of the state question, I apologize, I didn't hit on that. Yes, are we seeing that there is higher stuff here? Absolutely. But there's also data that indicates that it's happening up in like Bemidji and Moorhead and, up in Duluth and down here in the cities and southern part of the state. And so there is hotspots. And also what is very interesting is two things. One, some of our major hotspots for missing cases have been up in like Fond du Lac, Duluth area, and Mille Lacs-ish, Brainerd, Bemidji, and then St. Cloud, and then the Moorhead, and then also down in the cities here, right? And that's going to be probably because there's a lot of encampments here too. But sure. It's interesting. And the one thing that I was talking to a couple individuals about is, and this is just my assumption, this is not proving anything, but what I've noticed in my line of work is that if the counties that have more laxed prosecution or charges on domestic violence usually also have very lax prosecution on trafficking.
Interesting.
And I don't know if it's lack of education, lack of understanding a lot of the things, but also there's a lot of like components too with like our office is looking at suspicious death cases. And we're trying to like identify certain aspects because Hennepin County did a study with their opioid response. And this was the first year ever that Indigenous women were dying at a higher rate and overdosing than Indigenous men. And we saw that data. But what was interesting is I said, is anyone really focusing on this? Is anyone really focusing on the suspicion behind it? Is there trafficking? Is there sexual assault? Is there domestics where now the abuser maybe accidentally overdosed them or purposely overdosed them to shut them up, right? So there's a lot of that component. And so the work is never ending and you could really get into the weeds in the work. But yes, there is hot spots. But again, surprisingly, the rule for trafficking is very high.
Okay. Interesting. And you've been now with your office, the MMIR office now for about 2 years, correct? Just about 2 years. Okay. And can you give us an overview of that office and how it works with law enforcement?
Yeah. It's kind of unique. Again, I got to make my role. The role was already there, let me preface. But we realized what the office realized was what we thought the office should be doing is not what the community was needing or law enforcement or agencies that we were working with. There was this gap, right? And I think as you in law enforcement, advocates in law enforcement can go like this. And it's not because no one's not doing something right. It's because there's different ways to do it and the parameters of what can be shared and what can't and yada, yada, yada. And everyone really kind of works in silos and the bridges are never really fully built to go over and back again. And so our office, again, we are a mighty team of 5 that cover the whole entire state. So it's really interesting because our first director was a commander at St. Paul PD forever. And then she came over and she's Indigenous herself, Juliet Rudy, and she's the one that started our office and gave it the foundation. So my role, she let me, like I said, kind of rework it. And I, coming from the BCA, I'm not law enforcement myself, but I've worked in it. I live with one and I have done it my whole career. And I have a heart for it, but there's things that lack, and I'll be very transparent. There's a lot of things that lack, and there's some old school mentalities that need to get out and new fresh blood needs to come in. and some empathy needs to happen. And it's hard when it's cynical work, right? And it's a revolving door. And coming down here when I'm not from here, is hearing that like runaway youth, which I also don't like that term, is finding a needle in a haystack. And so and one law enforcement investigator cannot view all of these things, right? And some of the rule stuff is, if you're an investigator, you're doing general crimes. You're not doing one specific thing. You're doing all general. So if we can be that bridge and kind of like helping out, I always say being a tool within the toolbox, why would I not? And I think law enforcement, and you can push back on me, but they're very much like, what do you have to provide? Tell me now, or I have to move along, right? And if you don't have a good relationship with them and you don't talk the talk, they don't feel comfortable sharing certain things. So there's a lot of relationship building. There's a lot of aspects of that. Also saying, you don't have to tell me anything, but here, I have a piece of information for you. Like, this would be helpful. Or do you need me to be the liaison between this and this? Like, what can I help you with? The other thing that we're doing is somebody's missing or murdered, right? There's a lot of components. There's a lot of people involved and a lot of communication that's not happening. So I usually sit down, and what law enforcement doesn't want to do is have another meeting on their books, right?
Sure.
And so I say, here's the questions from the family. This question would go to the medical examiner's office. So law enforcement, you don't have to answer it. This question would go to prosecution, so we don't have to answer that. Like, we formulate very specific questions for the specific entity that they want to know the answer to. And then also I facilitate the multidisciplinary team response. I also am trying to, like I said, training is something that I do. The other thing that I do is we're trying to do something tangible. So it's called Data Pilot. It's phenomenal. It's kind of like a Cellbrite or a Gray Key, but at a very less of a expense. And also it can be dynamic and go anywhere with you on a tablet or your phone. And then you can do a consensual phone dump or your search warrant. And so those are things that we're getting. Then we're getting law enforcement or the court certified training. And then we can then take a phone. Let's say we're out in a search and family says, here, I have their phone, and we can plug it in and it's consensual. We can then take up that write-up of that report and that analytical write-up and hand it to law enforcement and be like, look, here's this. And so there's a lot of things that we are able to do, but we're also really trying to build relationships with law enforcement.
Sure.
And it's been going well, but as you know, it's time and it's showing up and it's being consistent and proving that you can do something with it, right? So I guess I'll just share this quickly. One of the investigators at St. Paul PD called me the unidentified female that had overdosed, and there was a suspect in the house. They didn't know for sure. They were trying to figure it out, but they didn't have a name. They didn't have a location, a next of kin, a tribal enrollment. And they called us because of the relationship that we had built. And we were able to figure out that next of kin, help them with that. Also tribal enrollment, figuring out what her name was. And those are things that we're able to help out with. So that's one less thing that is really cumbersome for them to do. So like, again, we can help out and be that assistance with that investigation. Why wouldn't we?
Excellent. And I love your whole thing that you're talking about, that you're there as part of a team to help them with that and to build those bridges. So with that, what can law enforcement and dispatch, because I think dispatch is a huge part of that as well, right? I mean, they are the first responders. They are the ones that are getting this information in. And, you know, a lot of the dispatchers I talk to have great intuition that maybe they are starting to think, hey, maybe this is kind of more of a human trafficking deal, or they're starting to pick up on that. What can law enforcement dispatchers do to impact these cases as well? Something that you could say to that.
Yeah. I'll start with dispatch. One thing I will start off by saying is that has been a thing, an aspect of the investigation, the initial call, that it's never on the dispatcher. It's the lack of the training that gets involved, right? Or that understanding that a lot of the crimes, like we earlier talked about, are overlapping. Or when they get a call, like you said, that's intuition, there's something else there. It's interesting because we actually had a situation just this fall where there was a potential high risk trafficking occurring in the moment, and people weren't calling 911. They were calling a non-emergency number. So that had to have training from us. Also, I talked with multiple law enforcement and even dispatchers themselves. And I said, what needs to be said so that like it doesn't get labeled as a suspicious call and it sits down here in priority versus a gun call, right? Like that's actually happening, because it's going to be that and especially in law enforcement right now in the current climate is there's not a lot there for staffing, right? In certain areas of the state. And I said, so what do we need to tell community? What do we need to tell the average Joe, if you will, or Jill or Joe, like what you need to say, and not to interrupt if something is happening, because now you're putting yourself at risk and also the victims at risk. And so the other thing is informing dispatch too, like the Brandon's law. So if somebody is reporting somebody missing, it doesn't need to have a wait time. It can be within the 15 minutes that they're missing. That's Brandon's law, right? It's not that 24 to 48 hours. The other thing about dispatch, when we were up in Canada, again, they think that they're learning stuff from us. And I'm like, no, we're learning things from you. Washington State was there, and Washington State Patrol is phenomenal. They have been in this line of Indigenous work for quite some time, and they have a 92% success rate on missing and murdered and trafficked individuals being rescued or recovered, or cases getting closed that are cold cases before, right? One is because if you go around our state, you'll see that our name, the Missing Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, MMIR, is on billboards. And that's one thing that we were doing. Well, I said, what are you guys doing? Because I'm dyslexic. If I'm driving down 35 and I'm cruising 80 miles an hour, if I see a number, I'm already messing it up by the time I just passed, because I'm like, I can't put all this together. And also, why are we putting that responsibility on civilians to call a specific number? And what is the number that everyone knows? 911. So the other thing is, most common person only has a third grade reading level. So you have to make things very like accessible and very easy. And one thing that we ended up doing is they said, we didn't put the specific number for like a law enforcement agency or a tip line. We put 911. And then that dispatcher was trained to look up the name of the report that was coming in about that missing person or that tip that was coming in about that specific case. And then they linked it back to the jurisdiction that had it. So that's what made sense. And so that's one thing I'm really trying to push on. And yes, it doesn't fall on dispatch, but also like more tips would then start flooding through, I believe. And also they started putting up cold cases that would generate new tips coming in. That was also successful. And the other thing that was really successful was how law enforcement, even if you have a cold or unsolved case, re-pushing that stuff up, saying and asking for help, asking for more information, looking back at stuff that maybe wasn't interviewed prior.
All right, Taylor, and you spoke about that, about what dispatchers could do in law enforcement, and I kind of want to get into this spectrum of things, and starting kind of from, you said dispatchers. I want to get in a little bit into law enforcement here, then what community members can do, and then after that one, I want to get into more of what we can do as maybe parents or that kind of way to help prevent these kind of things from happening. So talked a little bit about the dispatcher stuff. Now, how about we move on to the next part with just during routine calls for law enforcement, what should officers do regarding trafficking? You know, maybe it's a traffic stop, routine calls. What kind of things can they do? We talked about dispatch. Let's talk about the law enforcement kind of things. What can they be looking for? How can they help?
Yeah, again, it's always going to be looking beyond that initial call, especially if it's, you know, I hate the word routine traffic stop, because really what's always routine about it, and traffic stops are like the most dangerous on top of domestics. And like I said, I think the one thing I will say is, like, one, your intuition's never going to lead you astray. So that is one thing I want to start off with. The other thing is really seeing, like, why maybe an older male with a younger girl, do they know where they are? Like, what's the dynamic here? Is there a power and control dynamic? Is the person not able to talk? Or when you're asking like basic demographics of the individuals, something is being lagged or weird, or they're looking for the other person to, like, before they answer, because now there's a curated story, multiple phones, multiple cards. Why do you have, you know, like a small duffel bag, but you just went on like a week-long trip? Like, are things adding up? Also, like I said, the substance use thing is kind of goes hand in hand. Why is there a lot of cash maybe, right? Or why is there all the items being held with one person, and inconsistent stories? And I know that that's hard, like, right? I talked earlier about trauma, but if the stories really aren't consistent, is there physical assault going on? Is there a sexual assault? Did the person get offered a sexual assault exam? Like, lots of things that we can talk about. Also, is there, like, when you're looking at the car, does it make sense? And also the items in the car, do they make sense for the people? Do they match the people, right?
Right.
Oh, maybe you don't have a career or a job, but you have a $5,000 Prada purse in the back, right? Like, so
Right.
there's some dynamics. Or you're 15 and you have a Prada purse and you're homeless. That doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
So things like that. Also, you don't have income, but your nails are all done. That's $100 nails, and now you're wearing Air Force Jordans. And so, like, again, if things are not adding up, like 1 + 1 = 2, not always, sometimes it can equal whatever else, but like, if the story is not always linear and making sense, there's some inconsistencies there. So there's things like that. The other thing I think law enforcement can do is training is the utmost important thing you can ever do for law enforcement. And one thing I cannot stand for law enforcement is, especially if somebody gets thrown into investigations, they get the backlog of everyone else that was there before them. And they're saying, go have fun, go figure it out. Some, right? And also very much old school. And does that set that investigator up for success? No. Does that set the victims or survivors up for success with that investigator? No. Does the investigator know their resources? The one thing I always train on too is, if you're going to be in this work or any work in general, it is your responsibility as a provider, whether you're a service provider, an advocate, a social worker, yada, yada, mental health status, or law enforcement. You need to know what your resources are in your community. That is your responsibility, and know who a point person is. Get to know them. Because whether you like them or not, they can help you out in a situation that you're in a bind with. So that's one thing I always train on too, is I was always available for people, and that people were always available for me, because we had that relationship, and that's what made things successful. And that's what made the everything turn smoothly. Right. And because this is an interesting dynamic, and it's like trudging through a tsunami. Like, you're like, in no case is ever the same. You see very similar things. But I think the other thing too is really having good relationships with, like, prosecutors too, so that things can move forward, understanding what you're charging, and sometimes having to be creative on what you're charging. And lastly is not just training investigators, but for training patrol staff, because that's who initially is going to show up to a call and have to write the initial report. And if the initial report is not meeting specifics to be moved into investigation, then what happens? Absolutely, maybe nothing, or very minimal, right? So we have to have good report writing. We have to have good training. We have to have good relationships all around, and not working in silos.
To help with that, yes. It's all linked together as a team, and all the way from the dispatch to the call to the first responding officer, if they're picking up on little indicators that they're seeing, that can then push up to investigators getting your team involved. So with that, you already talked a little bit about it, and I want to just separate these two, but maybe members of the community, and then we'll get into more of your parents and, of youth that are probably scared to death of this stuff, rightfully so. But members of the community, people that are, maybe traveling, maybe they go up ice fishing, maybe they go to casinos, maybe they're going to rest stops, they're going to the airport, some things you already kind of touched on or whatever. But what is things that community members could help with if this is something that they are very interested in? What is some things that you could tell them about this?
Yeah. Getting really accurate training, like, and resources. If you need anything, contact, like, here in Minnesota, there's Safe Harbor through the Minnesota Department of Health, right? They have immense resources. Us, the BCA, local law enforcement, any type of advocacy agencies or nonprofits too, that work in, sexual assault, domestic violence, are probably going to cover trafficking. And so knowing that, but also knowing to not intervene all the time either, and really kind of figuring out, like, is this not only not safe for me, but am I putting that victim survivor at risk too? And because I approached them, now are they going to be at maybe a worse situation that I didn't realize, right? And also, are you maybe ruining evidence? So things like that. The other thing is, even if you don't know it is trafficking, because you're never going to be 100% sure, report it so that, like, And here's what I will say. This is the two options here in Minnesota. I always say report things, even if it's not always an emergency, report it, because trafficking is like a puzzle. It really is. It's like, I hate puzzles. I don't do puzzles. But like, if you think about it, you're always looking for that one piece that you think can fit here, but you got to kind of figure it out. And then you realize it's not it. But that one piece that you think doesn't matter is going to really put that one piece back in to fill the full picture. And what I mean by that is your one tip could be a huge thing behind the scenes that you're not aware of like a whole different thing. And that one tip really pushed it forward. So I always say that, and don't overcomplicate it as a community member or civilian. Call 911, period. Just talk to your local law enforcement agency. Don't get like super into the weeds of who do I call. Just call 911. And the other thing is, if you don't know all the details and you don't feel comfortable calling 911, there is the BCA human trafficking tip line. You can email it. I can provide those resources for you after this. You can do an email, or you can call and it goes to the operations center, and the operations center then links that tip to the commander or an analyst who then kind of vets it, and an investigator will call you back to get more information. If you don't know everything, those are the two options. Don't overcomplicate it. Law enforcement always just wants the tips so that we can move things forward. And if they're asking for your information, it's not, to get you in trouble. It's to then follow up and get more information about what is potentially there. So that's the other thing I tell community members. Don't think that you're going to be in trouble. That's not what they're calling back for. They're calling back to get more information regarding the situation.
Excellent. And so you have those people, and this is just a great example of when I would have been around as a police officer 18 years and people would ask me things. You have someone that says, I just had this feeling that I went into this area and something wasn't right. My intuition was telling me something. That's where you're saying either call 911, have that, or you can reach the BCA office with that to give them. And I think, just being a great witness, right? Like what kind of detailed information, if you can have that really match, what was about that was giving you that impending feeling of doom or that intuition that something wasn't right there, trying to have that and log that so that you have some good information that you can give them. Would you say that's kind of along those lines for a community member?
Totally. And the other thing that you kind of just made my mind think about that I didn't think about earlier is, like, for example, I had this gal come up to me after one of my trainings, and she was a teacher, and she said, I was at Ulta and, a makeup store. And she said, something was sitting weird with me, woman's intuition, whether you believe in it or not. And she said, I walked up to this girl and I said, if you need anything, let me know. And I said, did you report it? And she's like, no. And then it made me think about, even if you don't know where to report it, just make the tip. Send that information into law enforcement. Say what date and time you were there, what agency you were at or store, and they have cameras.
Right.
Like, why would you not do that? Then we can get, the date and time this individual was there, maybe when you approached them. If the cameras, that point, we can see them go out to a car, identify the car by the license plate, and really breaking down simplistically, like if you don't know much of anything and you're by a car, get the make and model of the car, get the license plate. Get the description accurately. Just put that information in. It seems like nothing, but that, like, again, can go into a bigger puzzle piece that really paints the picture for everything that you're not even aware of. And lastly, I'll say is people always get very frustrated, I noticed in community, when they're like, well, I called this in, I don't know what happened. You're not going to, especially if it's an active investigation. We can't. They can't share that information with you, but they're grateful for the information. And if this was your family member, your daughter, your cousin, your sibling, your whatever, wouldn't you want somebody to call if something wasn't sitting right? Like, just call. And so I just wanted to push that information there. And if you're out in public, who cares? That's actually better, because we have, traffic cams and we have security camera footage. And if you can, take a picture of the license plate, but don't make yourself obvious to the point that, you're putting yourself at risk.
Excellent. No, I'm glad that you mentioned all those. And I love how you said that if this was your family member, would you want someone to do the same thing? And I think everyone can agree with that. And that just segues us right into that other part is, I've had a lot of parents. I was a teacher for a while, in the high schools, now I'm more of a college professor. And this was one of those topics that I've had a couple of sheriffs come in and talk about. But what is the biggest measure you could tell to give some parents some confidence into what they should be looking in? Because I know this is one of those things that is really scary that's out there. And I'm sure they're worried about their, teenage daughters or, those kinds of things. And they're thinking, what could I do to help prevent my child from becoming a victim of this? And what would you say to that?
Well, it's going to sound super like, okay, well, that's not helpful, but it truly is your best line of defense, is having a great relationship with your kids, because teenagers are hard, but having non-judgmental, open communication and have it ongoing. And if they're not going to tell you about themselves, they will talk about their friends. So be like, do you know of anyone of like this? The other thing is, it's not trafficking, but it's exploitation, is sextortion, right? And sextortion is in two different forms. It's financial and predatory. And so, one is predatory, where they're wanting the perpetrators, are wanting more explicit content. So like photos, videos, yada, 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 of minors. Then there's the financial, which actually is targeting boys at a way higher rate. And they're actually committing suicide anywhere from 4 to 8 hours after initially being sextorted. It's an epidemic that's happening here in the States. And it's usually individuals from a different country. And now, they end up talking and a nude image gets sent. And now they want to extort them for money and send it out everywhere. And it's really sad because, again, there's that. And so there's those pieces. The other thing I always say is being aware of what apps your kids are using. If you're allowing your kids to be on social media, you also need to be educated on what that app or gaming platform is. A lot of people think that like Roblox or Minecraft is just or Discord is just so innocent. Well, what do they all have in common? They have a chat feature, and a chat feature allows you to talk to anybody. And one thing I also talk about is, on a daily basis, and this comes from the FBI stats on, I think in 2021, that an average of 500,000 perpetrators, so 500,000, are online every single day. So now you have kids that want to be influencers and doing all these things. Well, what do you have to be an influencer? You have to have followers. Do you know who all your followers are? Absolutely not. And now I just said there's 500,000 perpetrators online every single day. And now think of all the people of those perpetrators are in your following.
Right.
So and the other thing I think is really interesting, and this has kind of stayed consistent in the last couple of years, is while talking to youth that were being exploited or trafficked, is I would say, well, how do you know them? Well, I don't. Or, oh, I just added them. And I'm like, okay, well, what's their real name? I don't know. I just know them by whatever their alias is, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. Do you have their phone number? No, I only talk to them on Snapchat. Well, why? And then also, like, why are we posting everything online? We have to also be aware of like what we're wearing. Like, and I'm not talking about explicit, content or clothing. I'm talking like, if I live in Fargo, North Dakota, and I'm from South High, where I graduated from, I'm not going to wear a Bruins football shirt, right?
Right.
Then I can go and Google this, my name, Bruins football, figure out it's from Fargo South specifically, find out the coach, go on the roster, look at that name, and then go into Instagram or wherever else. And so things like that you have to be very aware of. Also, as a parent, I always say you can't be a helicopter parent on everything that you do. But again, if you're going to allow your kids to have platforms, having rules and regulations on it, also going through their Instagram, who's liking their stuff, who's commenting, who's direct messaging them or DMing them. Why are gaming platforms being put in basements or bedrooms and not in the open area of the whole house? Also, why isn't there rules and regulations? Like, why isn't the phone being taken? You can also shut down the Wi-Fi to that device if you need to. Going through their phone, having, I call it a safety plan because I don't know what else to call it. Having conversations with them and saying, not if this happens, but when you're approached, what is your outcome? Let's see how mature you are. Do you know what to do? Are you going to tell us? Because time is of the essence. You need to tell us when something happens. And also, what do parents do? They literally victim blame without realizing they are. And I'm not trying to, shit on parents. I'm just saying that, like, what do? We say, oh my God, we talked about this. Why would you ever do that? That's such a bad choice. Okay, sure. But they're a kid. And the other thing is, now you just victim blame them. And do you think they're going to tell you anything else?
No, they're in fear of that. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So, they're not going to speak up. Yes.
So being aware of those things, being a parent now, I'm terrified for my kids to get older and have devices, but I mean, we're all going to mess up, but I think, like I said in the initial answer, is your best line of defense is open communication and having a good relationship with your kids. And if it's not you, appoint another trusted adult and know that like exploitation doesn't happen from strangers. It happens usually with who you know, or sexual abuse is usually within your circle. Having open communication is the best thing you can do for your kids.
Fantastic. And with that, you've already mentioned a little bit about this, but where can listeners go to learn more or get involved? I know you said Safe Harbor, MMIR. You mentioned something about the BCA. Do you have that information on you right now? If not, I can always put that later. But if they wanted to reach out about maybe they have a case that they found that they say, hey, this is something that I've now listening to this podcast, I think this is exactly what's going on here. Anything that you can give to get them more involved?
Yeah. A couple things. I'll try to keep it not so lengthy, but we as an office started a reward fund board. And so we have cases that would qualify as eligible. They have to be long-term, 6 months or more of missing or murdered or whatever that looks like, right? And so law enforcement can refer those to our office, and there's a tiered system, and I can provide those handouts. It's also not my baby. It's my coworker's baby. It's really cool. We're actually going to be paying out our first $10,000 reward. Like I said, there's a tier system. So there's 1, 2, and 3, and it has to lead to prosecution, evidence, a body, whatever it looks like. So basically it goes from like 2,000 to 5,000 to up to 10,000. So law enforcement can always refer. We're also working with prosecutorial offices and investigators' offices on cold or unsolved cases that actually we found out more information that could be, solvable. So those are things that are really cool. You can also go to our website. You can request technical assistance from myself. That goes straight to our email box, and that gets associated with me. If you either yourself or somebody that has a missing or murdered or unsolved or suspicious death relative that is Indigenous or identifies as Indigenous, they don't have to be enrolled. You can make the intake form. Our victim specialist, her name's Nita, will be calling you. They'll do a whole workup. And then I usually, if I need to get involved, I will. Also for law enforcement, it's really unique. I try to make connections all over. And so if you don't have a connection somewhere, I'll try to find you a connection, whether that's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, FBI, another state, into Canada, whatever that looks like. So we've had a lot of success with those. But again, asking for technical assistance, my email, I have a work phone. I can provide all of that. I call, text it, which is really nice. You don't have to just always email. And I also, if you're asking for even just trainings or like at an in-service or a conference or whatever that looks like, you can always ask our office, and we all specialize in little specific things. So whoever's fitting for that, or you have that niche, we can figure that out. And if it's not us, we'll refer. So we'll never leave you empty-handed. But yeah, law enforcement can go straight to our website. Same with any person. You really just have to be whoever, and it kind of is tailored to what you need. And if you want stats and if you want reports and things like that, we can provide that. So it's kind of unique that way.
Okay, excellent. And then how can people maybe that are listening to this that have conferences related to this, trainings that they're maybe looking at, and you kind of mentioned that with the website, but how can they reach out to you individually or get a hold of you?
Yeah. Again, I will provide my email, which is taylor.wencel@state.mn.us. And then I can provide my work cell phone. And then also, if you forget any of that, you can also, just like I said, go on the website, request a training, and it will go straight to me. And then whatever is needed and how to work out the logistics is phenomenal and easy. And our PIO will help out with that. And so, yeah, just have to basically do the tap of request. So it's for training or technical assistance for me.
Fantastic. And then Taylor, any final thoughts or advice for individuals, law enforcement, community members who want to help, or any parting words that you have to say about this? I can tell you're very passionate about this topic. I love talking with you today. Any parting words that you have?
Well, first off, thank you very, very much for having me on, reaching out. And this is super fun. 1, and 2, I'm glad that you can see the passion, because it's there. And I always say we leave the roles, we never leave the work. So I think that rings true. The one thing I will say is my goal, and I think our office's goal, is to get out the word of the missing, murdered Indigenous, right? And also all the risk factors that everyone can be exploited, even you and I, right? We all have vulnerabilities that are exploitable, or things that we look in the mirror and we don't like, and that we would like to change, or more money because we're all living paycheck to paycheck, right? So those are all exploitable. The other thing is knowing your resources in your community, I think is huge. That's how you can help. So if you run into a situation where you see somebody is like, hey, I don't know a lot about this, but here's a number for you. And if they don't want to take it, say, and they tell you to screw off, say, if you don't need it, keep it for somebody that will. That's one thing that has worked really well for me in my career. A year later, individuals have called. And just because you don't know if you make an impact, you do. And the other thing is, we all know who Gabby Petito is, and as we should, right? But I think we need to start looking at why media doesn't put out on Black or brown or any other ethnicity, really. And I think that it is a true thing. And I think we need to look into that and putting out why social media doesn't pick up on those aspects. Like you probably haven't heard of the name, Nevaeh Kingbird or Jeremy Dordain. And that's right in our backyard in this state. And we all know who Gabby Petito is. If we could have that same media coverage, think of the cases we could solve. And so those are things that I think if we have more people aware of the problem that we have, we would have a lot more tips coming in and cases being solved. So get involved, be aware of what's happening within your community, your city, your town, your little rural community, and also your state, and know what your resources are.
Fantastic. Well, if there's one thing to carry forward from today, it's this, I believe. Real impact lives at the intersection of strength and compassion. The work around missing and murdered Indigenous relatives reminds us that awareness without action isn't enough, and action without empathy misses the mark. Whether you're in law enforcement, a helping profession, or simply a member of the community, slowing down, looking beyond the surface, and responding with cultural awareness and humanity can save lives. Iron is doing the hard, disciplined work. Empathy is remembering the people at the center of it. We need both, now more than ever. Thanks for spending time with us today on the Iron and Empathy podcast, and thank you, Taylor.
Thank you.